The First Mithridatic War. Before I start, I need to clear something up. In my last episode titled Storm Clouds, I said that Mithridates had 6,000 chariots. What I meant to say is that he had 600 chariots. That's a pretty big difference. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. The year was 89 BC. There were 176,000 Romans in Asia. Mithridates called up his massive army, numbering 190,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, and 600 chariots, 300 warships, and 100 pirate allied ships. Aquilius ordered Nicomedes to attack Pontus with 56,000 troops. 40,000 under Aquilius would stay in Bithynia. Another 40,000 under Cassius were in Galatia, and the last 40,000 with Oppius in Cappadocia. Mithridates put his best friend Dorylaeus under the command of the Greek hoplites. They were peltists, archers, slingers, phalangites, Cappadocians, Scythians, and much more. Mithridates took a place on a mountain, acting, in this case, as Xerxes. His generals were Archelaus, who clashed with Sulla, Neoptolemus, who helped fight the Scythians, Arcathius, Mithridates' son, and Craterus, the chariot commander. The generals had around 40,000 troops and 130 chariots. There was a hill on the north of the battlefield, and the Amnias River on the south. The battle started. Neoptolemus charged the hill, but Nicomedes was ready and forced him down. Neoptolemus found himself in dire straits. He called for Arcathius. Arcathius, with his 10,000 cavalry, charged the phalanx of Nicomedes. Neoptolemus regrouped and charged again. Arcathius pulled back. Archelaus charged the left flank of the phalanx. He slowly gave ground. Craterus had been waiting. With Nicomedes trapped on both flanks, he smiled. He let loose the chariots. They flung like guided missiles. Arcathius was now behind Nicomedes. He charged, and the battle was over. Arcathius was now behind Nicomedes. He charged, and the battle was over. It was an absolutely stunning victory. They captured the war chest and all the prisoners they could. When they brought it all to Mithridates, he didn't keep any of it. In fact, he gave the prisoners food, water, money, and clothes for their journey home. Most of the troops joined Mithridates. It was at this point that Mithridates began to call himself Eupator, which means good father. Mithridates was, quote, Gentile in victory as he is terrible in battle, end quote. After this, Mithridates moved on. He sent forth 100 Sarmatian cavalry to scout ahead. They landed on 800 Bithynians. The Sarmatians crushed the Bithynians. Mithridates did what he did after the first battle. He let them go. Aquilius was horrified. He ran to the fortress of Protopacion in Bithynia. Neoptolemus and Nemenes, who was sent by Tigranes, caught up to Aquilius and killed 10,000 of his troops. Neoptolemus captured the camp and 300 prisoners, which Mithridates set free. They too joined him. Now what about the other two Roman armies? When both armies heard the news of the defeated generals, they both went over to Mithridates. Cassius camped east of Tralles and tried to raise another army. It was hopeless. He was forced to flee to Rhodes. When he heard of Mithridates' approach, he ran for Apamia. As he arrived, an earthquake struck. He ran again. This time he was going all the way to Rhodes. When Mithridates reached Apamia, he gifted 100 talents to the town so they could repair it. Oppius was alive, but barely. He was hiding in Laodicea. This was the first town that resisted Mithridates. Mithridates sent a letter to the town. He promised he was only there for the Romans. The city surrendered the Romans over. Mithridates would keep Oppius as his slave. Mithridates now sent his generals to secure southwestern Asia Minor. He was now being called a liberator in the same land where Aristarchus had his rebellion. When news reached the Roman ships blocking the Black Sea, the Greek sailors took over the ships and sent them to Mithridates. Mithridates made his headquarters in Pergamon. He began a massive coin printing job. Almost all the cities in Asia rejoiced. The Savior King had finally freed them. Mithridates continued to march across southern Anatolia with his army. Mithridates sailed to Kos, where he found Cleopatra III's treasury and her grandson. Mithridates kept him and raised him. Mithridates then took Stratonica. He then married Monime, after he paid her, and named her Queen of Pontus. Nicomedes was sailing for Rome. Oppius was in Mithridates' hands. Cassius was at Rhodes. Where was the man who started this war? Aquilius was on the coast of Lesbos. Mithridates found him in the city he was hiding in, Mytilene. They gave him to Mithridates. Mithridates paraded him around in Asia, facing backwards on a donkey. He was, quote, forced to repeat his name and the crimes he had committed in Asia, end quote. Mithridates then poured molten gold down his throat. One more drink for the glutton. In 53 BC, Surenna would do the same thing to Crassus, another greedy Roman general. Mithridates began to sweep through Central Asia. The Italians that were living in Asia ran for the major cities on the coast: Ephesus, Adramyttion, and Kaunas, which are just a few. By 88 BC, Asia was Mithridates. Mithridates' Blitz campaign is one of wonders. I always compare Mithridates' sweep through Asia like Hannibal's in the Second Punic War in Italy. The Asiatic Vespers. It was 88 BC. We all know what happened next. The massacre of up to 150,000 Romans. Yes, we all know what happened, but the real question is, how did it happen? How did Mithridates know that almost all the Asiatic towns would listen to him? How could he trust them? Mithridates was extremely paranoid, so it's a wondrous thing that he would trust them. One thing is for sure, this was a master-minded plot by Mithridates. Almost all the towns in Asia swore that they would kill all the Romans living there. In my last episode, we saw that the Asians hated the Roman taxes. So, we can agree that they wanted them out of Asia, and they would not stop at anything. The slaves, the poor, the rich, all helped to carry out King Mithridates' request. Eventually, it was thought that he killed 150,000. That's just too many, though. There weren't that many Romans in Asia. The more probable number would be 80 to 100,000. Even with this smaller number, it's still a lot. The one thing that gets all of us is that he kept it a secret. Secrets like this one are not easy to keep. The Asiatic Vespers often makes me think of the attacks on 9/11. They were a series of coordinated terrorist attacks by the Wahhabi Islamist terrorist group Al-Qaeda against the United States. Now, why would I compare two completely different things in different countries? Well, they were both held secret, and the world did not feel the shock of them until they happened. We know one thing. It was sent out at least a month before the Romans were to be executed. But again, how did this happen? There is very little evidence that points to this, but there has been some, like a sandal with a hidden message in the sole, or a horse's tail with a message woven within. Maybe even women's hair. The faithful day that this happened on must have been, at the very least, horrific. Statues were torn down. Every Italian was killed where they stood. They clung to the statues of their gods, but their hands were cut off. They ran for the coast, but they were caught and killed. One town, named Tralles, hired a thug from Paphlagonia. They rode in wearing wicker helmets, and high leather boots armed with scimitars. In no other episode of history did someone coordinate a genocide so perfectly and so well timed. Mithridates now was hated by the Romans as much as he was sealed in a blood alliance with the Asians. Velleius Paterculus commented on Mithridates in the year 30 AD. Quote, Mithridates possessed exceptional bravery and a great spirit, but in his hatred for Rome, he was another Hannibal. End quote. Before this massacre, the Athenians voted to send Anthenion to Mithridates. The Greeks saw Mithridates as a heroic freedom fighter. Mithridates in return gave Anthenion a gold agate ring and a purple robe, and Athenion wrote letters to Athens, telling them that Mithridates would free them. Eventually he went back. Here is his speech. I tell you of things which can never have been hoped for, nor imagined in a dream. King Mithridates is now master of Bithynia and of Cappadocia, and he is master of all of Asia, as far as Pamphylia and Cilicia. The kings of the Armenians and Persians are his guards. He is lord of all nations around the Black Sea and Pontus. Mithridates' dominions now encompass a vast territory. The Roman commander Oppius had surrendered and is in the king's retinue as a prisoner. Manius Aquilius, the consul who once celebrated a triumph in Rome for his victory over Cilician slaves, is now dragged around behind a horse ridden by the giant ogre Bastarna. The Romans living in Asia are bowing down before the gods. Others are donning Greek clothing, and many recent Roman citizens are reverting to their original nationalities. Every city in Asia is honoring Mithridates with divine honors and calling him a god. Oracles everywhere promise him dominion over the whole world. He is sending armies to Thrace and Macedonia, and even Europe is coming over to his side. Not only have the Italian rebels sending ambassadors in Mithridates, but the Carthaginians too, all begging with him to destroy the Romans. Athenians, we must not bear this state of anarchy any longer. I'm imposed by the Roman Senate, while it controls our government. The Romans have closed our temples and let our schools fall to dust. Our theaters are off limits, and courts of justice and school of philosophy are silenced. They have even taken the Pnyx, our sacred place of assembly, away from the people. Leading the army was Mithridates' son, Arcathius. He marched into Thrace. Metrophanes took some ships and soldiers to Euboea. Archelaus took Delos and sacked it for supporting the Romans. Here is Mithridates' official declaration of war in Pergamon before he went to Rhodes. Mithridates' speech is quite long, so here is the essential substance. It would have been desirable, began Mithridates, to have the opportunity to decide whether to be at war or at peace with the Romans. But even the weakest person must defend himself and retaliate when attacked. Now it is obvious that the Romans were not simply hostile. They have begun a great war, and now they must pay the consequences. I am confident of victory. You know as well as I do that the Romans can be beaten. We have already defeated Aquilius and Nicomedes and driven the Romans out of Cappadocia. The Romans are not invincible. The Samnites of Italy have defeated Roman armies. King Pyrrhus of Epirus won 3 battles against them. Hannibal was victorious in Italy for more than 16 years, and it was not military strength that defeated Hannibal in the end, but the bitter rivalries of his own people. The Romans have enemies everywhere. In Anatolia, the Romans have hammered deep hatred into our peoples by their corrupt government, rapacious tax collecting, and public auctions of our property. Ever since Rome was founded, the native Italians have carried on perpetual wars with Rome, fighting for independence. The Gauls, famed for their spirit and valor, invaded Italy and took over many Roman cities. The Romans are terrified of the Gauls and pay them ransom, but we can count the Gauls as our friends. Italy is being overrun by many thousands of these courageous people. Right now, the Teutones and Cimbrae are assailing Rome like a whirlwind. At this very moment, all of Italy has risen up in war, following the lead of the Marsi and the Samnites. These people are not demanding just independence, but also a share in the government and the rights of citizenship. At the same time, Rome is also torn by internal strife among its leading men. The conflict is just as bloody as the war with the Italians, and much more dangerous for Rome's survival. Even the Romans could pursue individual wars against each of their enemies. This collective assault will overwhelm them. How, asked Mithridates, can they imagine they could have their hands free for a war with us? We must fight the Romans sooner or later. Let us seize this chance and swiftly build up our strength. The Romans have their hands full of trouble. Now is the time. The Romans started a war against me when I was just a child. From the moment they took away Greater Phrygia, which they had granted to my father. This land already belonged to my great-grandfather Mithridates II, who received it as a dowry when he married the sister of Seleucus II. Ordering me to leave Paphlagonia was another act of war. My father had inherited Paphlagonia peacefully. I complied with all these harsh Roman decrees. I relinquished Phrygia and Paphlagonia. I removed my son from Cappadocia, even though I had won it fairly, and the Cappadocians requested my friend Gordius as their king. I even killed Socrates the Good when the Senate wanted to take over Bithynia. But did any of this mollify the Romans? No, they became more oppressive every day. The Romans sent Nicomedes of Bithynia, the son of a vulgar dancing girl, to attack Pontus. When I tried to defend my kingdom, they made war on me. The Romans hate the power and majesty of great kings of great lands. They cheated my grandfather, King Pharnacus I, who should have inherited Pergamon. They even mistreat their allies. After King Eumenes II of Pergamon had helped the Romans crush King Antiochus the Great, the Gauls, and the Macedonians, the Romans declared Eumenes an enemy and destroyed his son Aristonicus. No one rendered the Romans greater service than the African king Massinissa of Numidia, who helped Rome defeat Hannibal. Yet they turned on his grandson, Jugurtha, and viciously paraded him as a slave in chains before throwing him in prison to die. Why do the Romans hate great and good kings? Is it because their own history is filled with a string of shameful kings? Lowly Italian shepherds, Sabine soothsayers, exiles from Corinth, slaves from Etruria? These were the Roman royalty. The Romans are so proud of their founders, Romulus and Remus. By the Romans' own account, their founders were suckled at a she-wolf's teats. That explains why the entire Roman population has the temperament of wolves. Like wolves, the Romans have an insatiable thirst for blood and a ravenous hunger for power and riches. My family can be traced back on my father's side to Cyrus and Darius, the founders of the Persian Empire. On my mother's side, I am related to Alexander the Great and Seleucus Nicator, founders of the Macedonian Empire. Moreover, not one of the peoples in my new kingdom has ever fallen under foreign domination or been ruled by foreign kings. Even Alexander the Great never ruled Pontus, Cappadocia, Paphlagonia, Bithynia, or Armenia, not to mention Scythia. Before me, only two other kings, Darius and Philip, had ventured to even enter Scythia, much less subdue it. Any campaign beyond the Black Sea means extreme hardship and great risks. Not only are the nomads fierce and courageous, but they have no towns or property, and their land is protected by desert, wastes, and freezing mountains. These kings barely escaped alive from Scythia. When I went to Scythia, I was just a raw novice at war. Yet now, I draw most of my strength against the Romans from my allies in Scythia. Our war against the Romans on our own land is entirely different. Our climate is mild. No soil is more fertile than ours. No land has many important cities. If we take courage and pursue this war, I promise you, we'll spend more time celebrating than fighting, more time counting our riches than going on campaign. Think of all the wealth of Phrygia, Lydia, Ionia. We don't even have to storm these lands. All we have to do is occupy them. I've already recovered all of Pontus, Cappadocia, Paphlagonia, and the Bosphorus, my rightful domains. I'm the only man in the world who have subdued fierce Colchis and Scythia. My soldiers and my enemies can testify to my fairness and generosity. Mithridates boarded his flagship and sailed to take Rhodes, saying goodbye to his wife Monime. He sent forward his ships to attack the Rhodians, but Damogoras fled into Rhodes. The Rhodians burned their outskirts. Mithridates ordered his ships to attack the harbor all day while he camped in the outskirts. The Rhodians then sent out a bireme. The bireme attacked one of Mithridates' ships and captured it despite his troops fighting fiercely. The next day the Romans sent out 6 ships to look for one of theirs that had been lost. Mithridates pursued with 25 ships. At sunset, Mithridates ordered his ships back to the island. This is what Damogoras had been waiting for. He attacked Mithridates. During the confusion, a ship from Chios rammed into his own. His men fought with zeal, but were no match for the veteran Rhodians. Camping in the burned outskirts, Mithridates thought of a way he could get back at the Chians. The campaign for Rhodes was going horribly. Where were his land forces? They had, in fact, set sail, but they were caught in a storm and attacked by the Rhodian fleet. Badly damaged, they crawled onto land. One night, some Rhodian deserters had appeared in Mithridates' camp. The deserters had led Mithridates up to the temple of Zeus. Mithridates stationed some men up here with orders to light a fire signal. He prepared his soldiers and ships. Some Rhodian sentries had detected the soldiers and lit a fire to signal the city. Mithridates' men were tricked into thinking that this was the actual signal. They were easily beaten off. Had those deserters been double agents? It was time for the Sambuca to be brought up, a massive tower astride 2 ships. It was brought up against the seawall. At first, it horrified the defenders, but then a fireball was sent soaring through the sky and hit the tower. That's probably not true, but that's what we are given. Mithridates sailed back to Asia after this final loss. Mithridates left Pelopidas to continue the war in Lycia. Bad omens, gods, and even some of his Greek allies in the Aegean had turned on Mithridates. It seemed as if everything was going against him. He left his generals in Greece to carry on the war, while he stayed in Pergamon administrating. Back in Greece, Mithridates finally got some good news. The Romans couldn't spare any troops. Sulla had been appointed to go to Greece, but he couldn't. There was a civil war back in Rome. Plus, they had rebels going about killing everything. His generals managed to conquer all of Greece and up to Macedon. The Athenian army requested to be trained by Mithridates' generals, since it had been destroyed by the Romans. By 87 BC, the Halley's Comet flew through the sky. Rome shivered. Mithridates, he rejoiced. The Pontic troops in Attica continued the purge of Romans. The number for dead Romans was now 100,000. The majority of slaves in Greece joined Mithridates' grand army. As Archelaus marched through Greece, all Greek towns put aside their differences and sent troops to Archelaus. Arcathius in Taxilis, who was named after an Indian, marched into Macedonia with 100,000 foot soldiers, 10,000 cavalry, and 90 scythed chariots. Batraphanes took Euboea and made his headquarters in Chalcis, and now he sailed to Thessaly. As this was happening, Neoptolemus and Mithridates were sailing with more men to Chalkis, and Dorylaeus stood in Asia with 90,000 more troops. The Roman commander Bruttius was in Macedon with some troops. He sent out his fleet against Mithridates. Mithridates sailed back to Euboea after being defeated. His hospital and treasury were captured. Thousands of troops were killed. Archelaus met Bruttius at Chaeronea and fought for 3 days. As Bruttius was losing, an envoy from Sulla arrived. He ordered him back to Macedonia. Archelaus fled to Piraeus, the port of Athens. Mithridates, back in Pergamon, was in his theater. He had a statue of winged victory. The plan was to bring a crown. With her arms stretched out, she would put the crown on Mithridates' head, using pulleys and levers. As the crown inched towards Mithridates' head, all of a sudden, it collapsed. Mithridates ran to his magi and spies. He demanded the most fresh intelligence. There was nothing, except Sulla had set sail to Greece. This wasn't the most worrying news, however. How could Sulla's mere 40,000 men prevail against Mithridates' massive armies? As soon as Sulla arrived, the majority of cities in Greece went over to him. Archelaus, with his small army, awaited Sulla in Piraeus. As soon as Sulla came into view, he ordered his soldiers to attack with scaling ladders. Archelaus was ready and inflicted high casualties. Sulla fell back and took the towns of Eleusis and Megara. Sulla needed wood for his siege engines, so he chopped down all the sacred olive trees in the area. The Athenians were aghast to see this. Sulla then set out to bring down the wall connecting Piraeus and Athens. 2 slaves inside of Piraeus betrayed Archelaus. This is strange to say the least. All the slaves in Greece joined Mithridates' army. So why did these 2 betray Archelaus? It's not known and will never be. This is what they slung out using slings. Archelaus will sally out with an assault force to burn your engines, while his cavalry attacks your flanks. Sulla was ready, and killed the assault force. Sulla began to construct a mound to attack the walls. Archelaus erected towers for his catapults, and he ordered archers and slingers to guard them. He then gave torches to his troops to burn Sulla's mound. And he sent for the reinforcements of Mithridates. Neoptolemus stayed in Chalkis. The fighting outside of Piraeus lasted multiple days. Archelaus' men were winning, until a legion that was gathering wood came back. They turned the tide, just as Murena, Sulla's lieutenant, rallied the troops and killed more than 22,000 Pontic troops. As Athens was starving, Archelaus was informed of the traitors, and that Neoptolemus' troops were attacked in Chalkis. They lost 1,500 men, and twice the number were captured. Sulla continued to work on his mound. All winter, Archelaus kept up pressure and dug a tunnel. The mound collapsed, killing many Romans. Sulla's men rebuilt the mound and dug their own mine. Spears and swords clashed in the mines. Sulla eventually broke down a part of the wall. He ordered firebolts to be shot on the towers. But Piraeus' walls wouldn't burn. They had been coated in alum. However, Sulla lit a massive fire right under the walls, and eventually it cracked, killing many defenders. Sulla now attacked, pressing his advantage, but Archelaus was ready and brought up fresh troops and beat back Sulla. Sulla tried one more time. After fighting for hours, they were beaten. Archelaus held Piraeus for now. Sulla was having financial problems, so he raided the temples of Zeus at Olympia and Asclepius. Sulla marched to Athens. The Athenians took to the ramparts and mocked Sulla and danced around singing. The Athenians, however, inside were starving and barely living. So, wolf-like, Sulla ordered a trench to be built around the city. The Romans, after continuing to starve them, finally attacked. the Athenians were devoted to fighting for Mithridates and freedom. 5 legions attacked. The Athenians fought fiercely, but were no match for the Romans. Sulla sacked Athens so badly that they wouldn't recover till 200 years later. Sulla went to Praeus. He brought everything he had and attacked like a madman. Archelaus was astounded. He wanted to fight another day. Thus he fled and left Sulla sitting in a burned harbor. Sulla wasted so much and gained so little. Archelaus arrived in Thessaly and met with the main army. As he arrived, Taxiles had horrible news. Arcathius, Mithridates' son, had died from an illness. This brought immense depression to Mithridates. His son was loyal to his last breath. He was a grand war hero, and his father put ever-loving confidence in him. Mithridates locked himself in his court for multiple days. After this, the grand army called the Bronze Shields marched, numbering 120,000 soldiers with 90 chariots. The two armies met in focus, but the 40,000-man Roman army was horrified. The Bronze Shield troops were decorated with tattoos, gems, agates. Their weapons gleamed in the sun. They had long hair, something that the Romans considered barbarian. There were camels too. Their smell scared their horses. The Romans were, quote, huddled in the trenches, end quote. This is the amount of different tribes in the army. Roman slaves, Greeks, pirates, Thracians, Macedonians, Bastarnae, Sarmatians, Hanakoi, Albanoi, Albarai. There were Pontians, Bithynians, Phrygians, Paphlagonians, Cappadocians, Chaldeans, Cilicians, Galatians, Turret folk, Chalybaians, Tarbani, Armenians, Medes, and Syrians. Archelaus moved southeast and camped in Chaeronea. Now Archelaus didn't want to fight here, but it was a good camping place because of the rocky landscape. 2 pro-Roman Greeks told Sulla of an area above Archelaus' camp. It was a good spot to drop boulders on the troops in the camp. Sulla prepared his army. The battle started. Rocks poured down on the Pontic camp. A cacophony of screams and shouts filled the air. Sulla charged the army that was now on the field. Archelaus lost his number advantage. Archelaus sent forward some cavalry to hold back the Romans. This worked for some time. Eventually, they were killed. Archelaus was desperate. He launched 60 scythe chariots. They didn't have enough room to gain speed. The Romans stepped aside and killed the drivers. Finally, Archelaus rallied his troops. The barbarians locked their shields together and put their spears out. The Romans were amazed to see 15,000 slaves fighting in the front ranks. The Romans scoffed at them, but the slaves were fighting for freedom. They would rather lose their lives here than be enslaved again. Archelaus now led a cavalry charge. It was a wild success. The barbarians, quote, fought at the highest pitch of valor, end quote. Now Taxiles led his brazen shield pikemen into the fray. After fighting for their lives, both wings of the Pontic army broke. Archelaus tried to rally the troops, but there was no room. Only 10,000 of the original 120,000 escaped. Not many people believe that Sulla lost less than 20 troops. In fact, he probably lost within 100 to 1,000 troops. Archelaus, with the remaining 10,000 troops, sailed to Euboea. Sulla then erected 2 victory monuments for his win. Sulla's monuments were found in 1990 by John Camp and students of the American School of Classic Studies. Appian remarks that Archelaus came back to his headquarters in Chalcis, quote, more like pirates than soldiers, end quote. As all this was happening, Flaccus was sent to replace Sulla. but he was inexperienced. He marched towards Thrace, and then was killed by his officer Fimbria in a mutiny. We will see them later. Back in Greece, Sulla was amazed to hear that 90,000 soldiers had taken back Boeotia. Mithridates back in Pergamon heard the news of his defeated generals, so he taxed Asia for the first time and ordered Dorylaeus into Greece. 80,000 fresh, highly motivated, and experienced troops came into Greece, eager to get back at Sulla for their defeat. The army camped near the town of Orchomenus. It was exactly what they wanted. It was flat and open, easy for their 10,000 cavalry to maneuver. Sulla camped in front of Archelaus. Seeing all the cavalry, he ordered his men to build trenches. The two Pontic generals responded by sending out their cavalry. The battle was almost lost before it began. The cavalry crushed the Romans into their camp. Sulla saved the day by rushing out screaming, "Romans, I will win an honorable death here without you. When they ask you where you betrayed your commander, you'll have to tell them about Orchomenus." The cavalry was forced to flee. The Romans pushed into the Pontic archers. They were forced to use fistfuls of arrows as makeshift swords. Sulla again was building his trenches. This time Archelaus brought out his whole army. Scythed chariots in the front. Behind them were the phalanx. Behind them were the runaway slaves, armed in the Roman style. The cavalry was on the wings, though their ability was crippled. The chariots rushed forward, but the Romans had javelinmen waiting. The chariots ran for safety. The chariots hit their own troops, causing mass confusion. Sulla's men pressed forward. Archelaus threw his cavalry into the fray. Sulla had foresaw this. He ordered his cavalry to block the Pontic cavalry, but his cavalry was almost overran. The infantry barely saved them. The day ended. The Pontic generals were astounded. They lost 15,000 men. The next day, Sulla besieged the camp. He could not allow Archelaus to get away. He began to build trenches again, this time around the Pontic camp. Archelaus announced that the Romans have the audacity to besiege us while we outnumber them 2-1. The Pontic troops fought like wild men. In the end, it was the discipline of the Roman legions against the spirit of the Pontic army. Eventually, the Pontic troops were forced back into their camp. A corner of the Pontic camp was brought down, as the two armies stared at each other for an ungodly amount of time. A Roman officer attacked, and the fighting started again. The Pontic troops fought side by side as they were all killed. Archelaus and Dorylaeus were presumed to be dead, but after hiding in the marshes for 2 days, they came out and sailed back to Euboea, waiting for Mithridates to hear the news of another defeat. The loss of his son and his armies was not something Mithridates was expecting. How could Sulla's mere 40,000 men beat Mithridates' massive armies? Mithridates prepared Asia. He sent out agents to arrest turncoats. The Galatians were a problem. Mithridates knew that. If the Romans got into Asia, that the Galatians would side with the Romans. He invited 60 of their princes to Pergamon. However, they were actually prisoners. Mithridates put arsenic in all the meals. Somehow 3 of the princes lived. They rushed home, raised an army, and pushed Mithridates' satrap Eumachus out. Some other Galatians were going to be used as examples. They were to be killed by sword and left to be rot in the fields. But one of them, named Bipolitanus, was spared by Mithridates. He was young, and probably reminded Mithridates of his own son. The next day, the wife of the Galatians was caught burying her husband. She was to be killed for this crime. However, the Poison King allowed her to bury him. This enhanced his reputation for mercy. Mithridates still trusted his general, Cornocorix, who was Galatian, and his Galatian lover Adabagina. Next was Chios. They were the same ones who rammed Mithridates' ship at Rhodes. Mithridates sent his generals Dorylaeus and Zenobius. They captured the city with an army. Here is Mithridates' letter to the town of Chios. Why, he demanded, have you refused to confiscate the Romans' property as agreed? Why have you allowed the Romans to flee to Sulla, for cooperating with Sulla in conspiring against me? All my friends say I should condemn you to death. But I am merciful, wrote Mithridates. I will be satisfied if you turn in weapons and send the children from the leading families of Chios to me as hostages. The Chians gave over their arms and the young men and women of aristocratic families to Zenobius and Dorylaeus, who sent them to Pergamon. But Mithridates was not finished with Chios. Zenobius read out another royal letter. I know that you still favor the Romans, but instead of the death you deserve, I sentence you to pay a penalty of 2,000 talents. The Chians gathered ornaments from their temples and women's jewelry to pay the fine. Following Mithridates' secret orders, Zenobius summoned everyone, men, women, children, and slaves, but no foreigners, to this theater to weigh out the goods. Fear shot through the crowd as Zenobius thundered, "You have short-changed the king." Zenobius then brought all the Chians to work in the mines of Colchis. Zenobius went to Ephesus next. When he got there, he went in the theater alone. The Ephesians killed him. Other towns, Tralles, Hypaepe, Mesopolis, Smyrna, Colophon, Sardis, all rebelled. 2 men from Smyrna invited 2 men from Lesbos. They plotted to kill Mithridates. One of the men from Lesbos was Mithridates' friend. He warned him by hiding Mithridates under a couch and allowing him to listen to the talks. The 3 men were tortured to death. Fimbria was now in Asia. He raided Asia like a tornado. Back in Greece, Mithridates told Archelaus to make peace with Sulla on the best possible terms. Mithridates was being tracked by Fimbria, so he sent orders to his youngest son, Mithridates the Younger, to hold him off, but his son lost 6,000 cavalry. Mithridates fled from Pergamon to Paetina. Fimbria besieged it. Lucullus showed up from his ship-gathering mission. Fimbria sent an envoy to Lucullus. He told him to besiege the port, but Mithridates had a plan. He sent an envoy to Lucullus, telling him that he needed to sign the peace treaty with Sulla. Lucullus let Mithridates go. Sulla and Mithridates met at Dardanus. This was the peace that Archelaus achieved. Return to territorial status quo of 89 BC. Greece belongs to Rome. Mithridates keeps his possessions as of 89 BC, but withdraws from Paphlagonia, Bithynia, and Cappadocia, allowing Nicomedes and Ariobarzanes to recover their thrones. Sulla promised that Mithridates would be declared a friend and ally of Rome, upon Mithridates' payment of a fine equal to the cost of the war. Mithridates must give Sulla 70 fully equipped bronze-armored warships, depending on sources. Mithridates must release all Roman prisoners of war, including captive ambassadors and officers. All Roman deserters and runaway Roman slaves who had joined Mithridates' armies must be surrendered to Sulla. A general amnesty would be declared. No reprisal against partisans. Each man was a master showman, skilled in the art of self-presentation. Each man scored propaganda points with oratory and body language, witnessed by thousands on the plains at Dardanus and recorded for history by Appian and Plutarch. Mithridates, defeated but still not beaten, wanted to make a strong impression. He was accompanied by Neoptolemus's 200 ships, Dorylaeus' 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, and a throng of scythe-bearing chariots. The victor's party was more modest. Sulla brought 1,000 men and 200 cavalry. Mithridates, in his old Persian finery, walked forward, hand outstretched. Sulla, standing at attention in Roman attire, stiffly asked whether Mithridates accepted the terms agreed to by his generals, Archelaus. Mithridates did not reply immediately. "Surely," spat out Sulla, "it is the victor who has the right of silence, while a suppliant should ask forgiveness." Mithridates broke his dramatic silence, pointing out that he and his father had been good friends of Rome. But Roman ambassadors, governors, and generals started this war out of pure greed, the vice of most Romans. They wronged me by taking Phrygia and Cappadocia. They urged Nicomedes to attack my kingdom. Everything I've done since then is in self-defense and of necessity. I know you are a clever orator, Sulla cut in, always justifying your wrongdoing. You should have sent an ambassador long ago if you thought you were the victim of injustice. You had no right to Cappadocia and Phrygia. Nicomedes attacked you because you sent an assassin named Alexander to kill him, and you armed his rival, Socrates the Good. You have been planning this war for a long time, thinking you could rule the whole world. Why else have you allied with Thracians, Sarmatians, and Scythians? That's why you built up such a huge army and navy, and that's why you timed your takeover of our Asian province while we were subduing revolts in Italy. You freed our slaves and canceled debts. You killed 1,600 men on false accusations. You poisoned the princes of Galatia. You butchered or drowned all the residents of Italian blood in Provincia, Asia, including mothers and babies, not even sparing victims who fled into temples. What cruelty, what impiety, what boundless hatred you showed towards us. Playing to the audience of soldiers, officers, and officials, Sulla continued to castigate Mithridates for war crimes, even declaring himself the liberator of Greece from the slavery of Mithridates. You invaded Greece and deprived the Greeks of their freedom. Mithridates' final card was unspoken. Deal with me, or I deal with Fimbria. Knowing he had the upper hand, he calmly broke in on Sulla's vehement discourse. I consent to the terms agreed by my general Archelaus. Sulla and Mithridates then kissed to seal the agreement. Thank you all for watching this episode. I know it was long, but I wanted to do all of the First Mithridatic War in one episode. You can find me on Instagram at LoneBerserkerYT. You can also find my store, www.theriseoftheeast.com. Thank you for watching. This has been the Rise of the East podcast.